The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. No return address. Just my name scrawled in faded ink across yellowed paper. Inside, a single sheet with handwriting I didn't recognize. Congratulations. You've been selected for employment aboard the Maiden's Grief. Report to Pier 47 at dawn. Ask no questions. Follow the rules. I hadn't applied for any fishing job. Hell, I'd never even been on a boat before. But my bank account was bleeding zeros, and my landlord had started leaving increasingly creative threats under my door. Desperation makes fools of us all. Dawn came gray and cold. The Florida coast stretched endlessly in both directions, shrouded in morning mist that clung to everything like wet fingers. Pier 47 sat at the far end of the harbor, isolated from the bustling commercial docks. The smell hit me first. Not the usual fish and salt combination you'd expect. This was different, deeper, like something that had been rotting in the sun for weeks. The Maiden's Grief bobbed gently against the pier. She was old, ancient maybe. Her hull bore scars from decades of battles with the sea. Painted over so many times, the original color was lost beneath layers of marine paint. Rust bled through in patches like old wounds that refused to heal. Captain Morrison stood waiting on the dock, tall, weathered, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked me up and down with the expression of someone evaluating livestock. "You're the new hand," he said. Not a question. "I got a letter. Did you read it carefully?" I nodded, though I hadn't really. The prospect of steady pay had been enough. Good, because on this boat the rules aren't suggestions, they're survival. His voice carried the weight of years spent screaming over howling winds. Rule number 1. Never look directly into the water after sunset. Not even a glance. He handed me a crumpled piece of paper. The others are written down. Memorize them. Your life depends on it. The crew was sparse. Tommy, a kid barely out of his teens with nervous eyes that darted constantly to the horizon. His hands shook when he thought no one was looking. Marcus, built like a brick wall, worked in complete silence. He'd been here longest, Morrison said. 7 years. In all that time, I'd later learn, Marcus had spoken maybe 50 words total. And then there was old Pete. Nobody knew his real name. He'd been on the Maiden's Grief longer than anyone could remember. His skin was leather, burned dark by decades of sun and salt. But it was his eyes that unsettled me most. They held knowledge, terrible knowledge that weighed him down like an anchor. I found a bunk below deck. The quarters were cramped, humid, filled with the constant groaning of old wood and rusted metal. The walls were covered in scratches. Not random marks, but deliberate. Tallies. Thousands of them, carved deep into the wood by desperate fingers. The rules were simple enough. Rule 1. Never look directly into the water after sunset. Rule 2. If you hear singing, plug your ears immediately and wake the captain. Rule 3. Never fish alone. Always work in pairs. Rule 4. If the fog rolls in, drop everything and return to port immediately. Rule 5. Never ask about the locked room in the stern. Rule 6. If you see lights beneath the water, do not acknowledge them. Rule 7. The night watch must never be alone. 2 men minimum. Rule 8. Never bring personal photos aboard. Rule 9. If someone calls your name from the water, it isn't them. Rule 10. Never count the catch. Let Pete handle the numbers. I laughed when I first read them. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. Every profession has its quirks, its little rituals designed to ward off bad luck. Fishermen were notoriously superstitious. These rules were probably decades old, passed down from captain to captain like maritime folklore. I stopped laughing after the first night. We'd been at sea for 6 hours when the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The water turned from blue to gray to black, reflecting the dying light like polished obsidian. I was securing lines when Tommy grabbed my shoulder. "Don't," he whispered urgently. Rule 1. I'd been about to glance down at the water to check our anchor line. Just a quick look. Nothing more. But Tommy's grip tightened, and I saw the genuine fear in his eyes. "Why?" I asked. "Because you won't like what looks back." Dinner was canned beans and stale bread. We ate in silence, the only sounds the creaking of the boat and the whisper of wind through the rigging. As darkness settled over us like a heavy blanket, Marcus and Pete took the first watch. I tried to sleep, but every sound seemed amplified in the cramped quarters below deck. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, barely audible over the usual maritime symphony. Singing. A woman's voice, hauntingly beautiful, drifting across the water like morning mist. The melody was unfamiliar yet somehow ancient, as if it had been carried on ocean winds since the beginning of time. I found myself sitting up, straining to hear more clearly. The voice was getting closer, or maybe we were drifting toward it. The song pulled at something deep inside my chest, a longing I couldn't name or understand. Footsteps thundered across the deck above. Shouting, the engine roared to life, and suddenly we were moving fast, cutting through the water with desperate urgency. The singing faded, but the memory of it lingered like an ache. Morrison found me in my bunk 20 minutes later. His face was pale. "You heard it," he said. "What was it?" "Rule 2 exists for a reason." He sat heavily on the edge of my bunk. "The first time you hear them sing, you think it's the most beautiful sound in the world. The second time, you'll do anything to hear it again. The third time," he shook his head. "We don't talk about the third time." "But what are they?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Wrong question, son. The right question is, what do they want? And the answer is always the same. Us." I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside seemed like singing. Every creak of the boat might have been something trying to climb aboard. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt like I'd aged a year in a single night. The next few days passed without incident. We caught fish. Good fish. More than any boat had a right to expect in these waters. Our nets came up heavy with red snapper, grouper, and species I didn't recognize. Pete counted everything, his lips moving silently as he made notations in a waterlogged ledger that looked older than the boat itself. "Strange how the fishing's so good out here," I mentioned to Tommy during one of our breaks. His face went white. "Don't question it, ever. Just be grateful and keep your mouth shut. But surely you've wondered—" "No." His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "I haven't wondered about anything, and neither should you. Wondering is what got Jimmy killed last season." Jimmy? No one had mentioned a Jimmy. When I asked Morrison about him later, the captain's expression went cold as winter storms. Jimmy asked too many questions. Jimmy didn't follow the rules. Now Jimmy feeds the fish instead of catching them. It was old Pete who finally told me the truth about Jimmy. We were working together, mending nets in the late afternoon sun. Pete's fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work since before I was born. Jimmy was curious, Pete said without looking up from his work. Curious about why we never fished in certain areas. Curious about the locked room. Curious about why our nets always came up full when other boats went home empty. What happened to him? Pete's hands stilled. Jimmy decided he was going to look into the water after sunset. Said the rules were superstitious bullshit. Said he wasn't afraid of some old wives' tales. The old man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We found him the next morning, standing at the bow, staring down into the water. "Been there all night," Marcus said. Wouldn't respond when we called his name. Wouldn't move. Just staring. Was he hurt? Not a mark on him. But his eyes. Pete shuddered. His eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils. Everything. Black as the deepest water. And when we finally got close enough to touch him, he just smiled and stepped over the side. "You didn't try to save him?" "Couldn't. The water where he went down. It was wrong. Darker than it should have been. And things were moving underneath. Big things. We threw life preservers, but they just sank straight down like stones. Never saw Jimmy come back up. That night, I volunteered for watch duty. I needed to understand what we were dealing with. Marcus and I took position on deck, armed with spotlights and emergency flares. The rules said never to be alone during night watch, but they didn't say we couldn't observe. The ocean was calm, almost unnaturally so. Not even the smallest waves disturbed the surface. It looked like black glass stretching infinitely in all directions. The stars reflected perfectly, creating the illusion that we were suspended in space between two identical skies. Around midnight, I saw the first light. Deep beneath the surface, a soft blue glow pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, or breathing. Marcus grabbed my arm when he noticed me staring. "Rule 6, he growled. One of the longest sentences I'd ever heard from him. But I couldn't look away. The light was hypnotic, beautiful in a way that made my chest tight with inexplicable longing. As I watched, more lights appeared. Dozens of them, scattered across the ocean floor like an underwater constellation. They pulsed in unison, creating patterns that almost resembled language. "They know we're watching," Marcus whispered. The lights began to rise. Slowly at first, then faster. coming up from the deepest parts of the ocean toward our boat. I could see shapes now, vague silhouettes surrounding each source of illumination, tall, elongated, moving with fluid grace through the water. "We should wake the captain," I said. Marcus shook his head. Too late for that. The first shape broke the surface 50 yards off our starboard side. The water barely rippled as it emerged. Human-shaped but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Too tall, too thin, joints that bent in impossible directions, and its face. I forced myself to look away, remembering Rule 6 just in time, but the image burned in my memory. Pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light, eyes like black holes in reality itself, and a mouth that opened too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that belonged in the deepest trenches of the ocean. More shapes were surfacing now, dozens of them. They floated motionless around our boat, watching us with those terrible black eyes, waiting. "What do they want?" I whispered. "Same thing they've always wanted," Marcus replied. "A trade." The singing started again, multiple voices this time, harmonizing in ways that human throats weren't designed for. The melody was different from before, older, more complex. It spoke of depths beyond imagination, of secrets hidden in underwater caverns where sunlight had never penetrated. I felt my feet moving toward the rail without conscious thought. The song was pulling me, calling me home to a place I'd never been but somehow remembered. Marcus's hand clamped down on my shoulder like a vice. "Fight it," he commanded. "Remember who you are. Remember where you belong." But the song was so beautiful, so perfectly, impossibly beautiful. It promised answers to questions I'd never thought to ask. It offered belonging in a world where I'd always felt like an outsider. All I had to do was step over the rail. All I had to do was go home. A splash behind us broke the spell. We turned to see old Pete standing at the stern, a massive fish in his hands. Not just any fish. This one was easily 6 feet long, with silver scales that reflected the creature's bioluminescent glow. Pete held it high above his head, and then tossed it into the water. The effect was immediate. The singing stopped. The shapes beneath the surface began to sink back into the depths, their lights fading like dying stars. Within minutes, the ocean returned to its normal state. Black water lapped gently against our hull. "The tribute," Pete explained when he saw our confused expressions. "Every night we're out here, we give them the biggest catch. It's part of the arrangement." "What arrangement?" Pete looked older than his years in the moonlight. "The one Captain Morrison's grandfather made in 1952. The one that keeps us alive and keeps our nets full. The one that lets us fish these waters without ending up like other crews who've tried." I thought about the news stories I'd heard over the years. Fishing boats found drifting empty, their crews vanished without a trace. Coast Guard investigations that turned up nothing but more questions. Families left behind with no answers, no closure. "How many crews?" I asked. 7 that we know of. Probably more. This part of the Gulf has always been dangerous. Most people just blame it on storms or equipment failure. Easier than accepting the truth. The truth. I was beginning to understand that the truth was far stranger and more terrible than any rational explanation. Over the following weeks, I learned more about our unusual arrangement. The creatures, Pete called them the deep ones, had territorial claims stretching back centuries. Long before the first European settlers arrived, they'd ruled these waters absolutely. Fish were theirs to give or withhold. Ships were theirs to sink or spare. Morrison's grandfather had been desperate. His family was starving, his boat was falling apart, and every trip out to sea came back empty-handed. So he'd done something that fishermen had whispered about in dockside bars for generations but never seriously considered. He'd made contact. Took him 3 months to figure out the right tribute, Pete told me one evening as we prepared our lines. 3 months of trial and error, of partial successes and near disasters. But eventually he worked out the terms. They provide the fish. We provide the biggest catch each night as payment. And we follow the rules that keep us safe. What happens if we break the rules? Pete's expression grew grim. Nothing good, the rules aren't arbitrary. Each one was learned through somebody's mistake. Usually their last mistake. I pressed for details, but Pete clammed up. Some knowledge, he said, was too dangerous to share. Some mistakes were too horrible to repeat, even in stories. It was Tommy who eventually told me about the locked room in the stern. We were hauling in nets during a particularly productive afternoon when I noticed him watching the door with nervous eyes. "What's in there?" I asked during our break. Tommy looked around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Evidence," he whispered. "Proof of what happens when people don't listen." Proof of what? Jimmy wasn't the first crew member to break the rules. Morrison's father keeps souvenirs. The way he said souvenirs made my blood run cold. What kind of souvenirs? Personal effects? Pieces of clothing? Sometimes, Tommy swallowed hard. Sometimes pieces of the people themselves. That night I found myself staring at the locked door. It was painted the same faded blue as the rest of the boat with a heavy brass padlock that looked newer than everything else on the vessel. No windows. No way to see inside. But I could swear I heard sounds coming from within. Soft scraping. Like fingernails on wood. I mentioned it to Marcus during our watch, but he just shook his head. "Rule 5 exists for good reason," he said. "Some doors are meant to stay closed. But curiosity is a persistent disease. The more I tried to ignore the locked room, the more it dominated my thoughts. What was Morrison hiding? What was so terrible that it required such secrecy? My chance came 3 weeks into my employment. Morrison had taken Tommy into port for supplies, leaving Marcus, Pete, and myself to maintain the boat. Pete spent most of his time in his bunk, claiming his arthritis was acting up. Marcus was focused on engine maintenance. For the first time since I'd joined the crew, I was essentially alone. The padlock was old, corroded, a few strategic taps with a wrench, and it popped open with a rusty click that seemed impossibly loud in the afternoon stillness. The door swung inward on squeaky hinges, revealing darkness so complete it seemed solid. The smell that wafted out made me gag. Death, decay, and underneath it all, the salty sweet scent of the deep ocean. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 6. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Crew members from decades past, all smiling, all unaware of their fates. Below each photo was a name and a date, and below that, a small pile of personal belongings, a wedding ring, a cigarette lighter, a St. Christopher medallion, pieces of lives cut short by curiosity or carelessness, or simple bad luck. But it was the far wall that made me drop my flashlight. The bones were arranged carefully, reverently, almost. Human bones, bleached white by salt water and time. Skulls with empty sockets that seemed to watch my every movement. Rib cages that had once protected beating hearts. Finger bones arranged in neat rows like some macabre keyboard. And in the center of this grisly display, a journal bound in waterlogged leather. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were filled with Morrison's handwriting, documenting decades of incidents and necessary sacrifices. Each entry was clinical, matter of fact, as if he were recording weather conditions rather than human deaths. July 15, 1987. Stevens violated Rule 9. Responded to calls from the water. Found him attempting to dive overboard at 0300 hours. Restraint was unsuccessful. Loss accepted as payment. March 22, 1993. Williams questioned the arrangement. Demanded explanations. Showed him evidence. Reaction was poor. Disposal required to maintain operational security. October 8, 2001. Rodriguez brought family photo aboard. Rule 8. Deep ones showed unusual interest. Trade was inevitable. Page after page of cold, calculated entries, each representing a human life sacrificed to maintain Morrison's unholy arrangement with the creatures below. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't hear the footsteps on deck above. Didn't hear the engine shut off as Morrison and Tommy returned early from their supply run. Didn't realize I'd been discovered until the captain's shadow fell across the doorway. Curiosity killed the cat, Morrison said quietly. His voice carried no anger, no surprise, just weary resignation. Rule 5 exists for a reason. I tried to explain, to apologize, to promise I'd never tell anyone what I'd seen. But Morrison just shook his head. Can't put the genie back in the bottle, son. Can't unsee what you've seen. And I can't risk you talking when we get back to port. Tommy appeared behind him holding a length of rope. His face was pale, but determined. I'm sorry, he whispered. I really am. But this is bigger than any one person. They bound my hands and feet with practiced efficiency. Morrison rifled through my pockets, removing my wallet, my keys, anything that might identify me. These items would join the collection in the locked room, I realized. Evidence of another crew member who'd learned too much. Nothing personal, Morrison said as they carried me toward the rail. But the arrangement must be maintained. Too many people depend on it now. Too many families fed by our catches. The greater good requires individual sacrifices. The water was dark below us, darker than it should have been with the sun still visible on the horizon. As they prepared to throw me overboard, I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. The deep ones were waiting. They knew what was coming. "Any last words?" Morrison asked. I wanted to curse him, wanted to scream about justice and murder and the innocent people who would miss me. But instead, I found myself asking the one question that had haunted me since I'd first stepped aboard this cursed vessel. Why do they need the tribute? What do they really want? Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. They're farmers, son. We're their livestock. The tribute isn't payment, it's fertilizer. Every fish we catch, every life we sacrifice, it all feeds something bigger. Something growing in the deepest trenches where light never reaches. Growing into what? The end of the age of man. The return of the old gods. And we're helping them prepare for their awakening. They lifted me toward the rail, but before they could throw me over, a sound cut through the evening air. Singing. The most beautiful, terrible singing I'd ever heard. Multiple voices harmonizing in patterns that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. Morrison and Tommy froze. The deep ones were rising faster now, their bioluminescent glow turning the water around our boat into a sea of stars. But something was different this time. The singing wasn't calling to us. It was welcoming something else. "They're not supposed to surface before midnight," Tommy whispered. "What's happening?" Morrison's face had gone pale. He set me down on deck and grabbed his binoculars, scanning the horizon in all directions. When he lowered them, his hands were shaking. "Ships," he said. "Dozens of them, all heading this way." I managed to crane my neck enough to see what had him so terrified. Lights on the horizon, but not the lights of normal vessels. These glowed with the same eerie bioluminescence as the creatures surrounding us, and they were moving wrong. Too smooth, too fast, cutting through the water without creating wakes. "The deep ones aren't the only things down there," Morrison said, his voice barely audible over the singing. "They're just the scouts, the advance guard. Tonight the real masters rise." The first ship breached the surface a quarter-mile away. It was massive, ancient beyond calculation, covered in marine growth that pulsed with organic light. Its hull was comprised of materials that hurt to look at directly, substances that shouldn't exist in our reality but somehow did. More ships followed, an entire fleet rising from trenches that no human had ever successfully mapped. Each vessel carried cargo that my mind refused to fully process. Beings that made the deep ones look positively human by comparison. Things with too many eyes, too many limbs, geometries that violated the basic laws of physics. 60 years, Morrison whispered. 60 years of faithful service, of following every rule, paying every tribute, and this is how it ends. The singing reached a crescendo that made the air itself vibrate. Windows on the maiden's grief cracked from the sound. Metal fittings began to corrode visibly. Decades of wear happening in seconds. And then, silence. The alien fleet had arranged itself in a perfect circle around our small fishing boat. Hundreds of vessels, each one a testament to technologies and cultures that predated human civilization by millions of years. The water between them glowed with that same organic light, creating patterns that resembled neural networks or circuit boards designed by inhuman intelligence. A figure materialized on our deck without climbing aboard, simply existed where moments before there had been empty space. Tall, impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to be made of living shadow. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely and appeared directly in my mind. "The arrangement is concluded." Morrison fell to his knees. "We've honored our agreement. We've fed you faithfully, followed every rule, given you everything you asked for. You have served adequately. Your species has served adequately. But the harvest season approaches and you are no longer required." The creature turned its attention to me. Those black hole eyes seemed to peer directly into my soul, reading every thought, every memory, every secret I'd ever harbored. "You have seen the records. You understand the true nature of the arrangement. Your species was never partners in this endeavor. You were cultivated, bred, prepared. Images flooded my mind. Not just words, but complete understanding. The history of humanity from the perspective of beings that existed before the continents had settled into their current positions. We weren't the dominant species on Earth. Never had been. We were livestock. Cattle raised and guided by intelligences so vast and alien that we could barely comprehend their existence. Every major disaster in human history, every plague, every war, every extinction event, all of it carefully orchestrated to cull the herd when populations grew too large, or when genetic diversity needed to be maintained. The survivors were allowed to rebuild, to multiply, to think they were masters of their own destiny, but always in the deepest places the true owners waited and watched. The time for subtlety has passed. The final harvest begins now. The creature gestured and the alien fleet began to move, not away from us, but up, rising out of the water entirely, defying gravity with the same casual ease they defied human understanding. Ship after ship lifted into the night sky, their bioluminescent hulls creating new constellations against the darkness. Your governments will attempt resistance, they will fail. Your weapons are toys compared to technologies that reshaped worlds when your son was young. Some humans will be preserved for study. Others will serve as food. Most will simply cease. Why are you telling us this? I managed to ask. Because you will survive. You will return to land. You will tell others what you have witnessed. Not because we fear your warnings, but because the terror serves our purposes. Fear makes the meat more tender. With that, the creature faded back into nothingness. The alien ships completed their ascent, disappearing into the star-filled sky to begin their work. Only the deep ones remained, floating motionless around our boat. Morrison had aged a decade in the space of minutes. His face was gray, his hands trembling as he untied my bonds. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything. I honestly thought we were buying humanity time, keeping them satisfied with small sacrifices so they wouldn't take everything at once. How long have you known? About the true purpose? Since I was your age. My father told me on his deathbed, made me promise to continue the arrangement, no matter how terrible it seemed. Said it was the only way to postpone the inevitable." Tommy was staring at the sky where the alien fleet had vanished. "They're really going to kill everyone, aren't they?" No one answered. The question didn't require an answer. We motored back to port in silence. The deep ones followed us for the first few miles, then sank back into their preferred depths. By the time we reached Pier 47, they were gone. The only evidence of the night's events was our own traumatized memories, and the metallic taste of fear that lingered in our mouths. Morrison destroyed the locked room before we disembarked, burned everything inside and scattered the ashes in the harbor. "No point in maintaining the collection now," he said. "The arrangement is over." I expected him to try to silence us, expected threats or violence or desperate attempts to maintain operational security. Instead, he just looked tired, defeated. "Tell whoever you want," he said. "Scream it from the rooftops. Warn the whole world if you think it'll make a difference. But remember, they've been planning this for millennia. Every contingency has been considered. Every possible resistance has been anticipated and countered. So we just give up?" Morrison shrugged. "We live what life we have left. Enjoy the time remaining. Say goodbye to the people we love." He walked away down the pier, shoulders bent under the weight of generations of terrible knowledge. I never saw him again. That was 3 months ago. I've tried to warn people, posted on social media, called news stations, contacted government agencies. Most people think I'm crazy. The few who listen just add my story to their collection of conspiracy theories and UFO sightings, background noise in an already noisy world. But sometimes, late at night, I see the lights in the sky, ships that move too fast and too silently to be human technology, and every morning, the news reports more unexplained phenomena: whales beaching themselves by the thousands, fish populations crashing overnight, strange sounds from the deepest ocean trenches that marine biologists can't explain. The harvest has begun, and there's nothing any of us can do to stop it. I'm telling you this story because you deserve to know the truth. Because in the time we have left, truth matters more than comfort. The rulers of this world are returning to reclaim what was always theirs. We were never the apex predators we imagined ourselves to be. We were always just fish in someone else's net. Listen for the singing. When you hear it, remember that some rules exist for reasons we can't fathom. Some doors should remain locked, and some truths are too terrible to bear, but bear them we must. Because the deep ones were never the real threat, they were just the shepherds, and their masters have finally come home.